The boy was 9 years old when he saw his first corpse, and it belonged to his mother. The room was cold in the way that Moscow rooms were cold in winter, which is to say, completely, the kind of cold that gets into the walls and stays there until spring. The year was 1837. She had been sick with consumption for months, coughing through the thin walls of their apartment in the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, where his father worked as a doctor. Her name was Maria, and she had been, by all accounts, the only source of gentleness in a household otherwise defined by his father's rages and the institutional gloom of living in a charity hospital surrounded by the dying. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky would spend the rest of his life writing about mothers, or more precisely, about their absence. The prostitute with the heart of gold, the suffering woman who redeems the man who has destroyed her, the memory of maternal love as the single thread connecting a murderer to his own humanity. But in that cold room in 1837, he was just a boy looking at his mother's face and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that some things leave and do not come back. His father, Mikhail Andreevich, was a doctor, but also a drunk, and also a petty tyrant of the sort that flourished in minor institutional positions throughout the Russian Empire. He had been born into the clergy, but clawed his way into the lower rungs of the nobility, acquiring the title and a small estate with serfs, though the family spent most of their time in Moscow, where the work was. After Maria died, something in him came fully unmoored. He drank more. He beat the serfs. He wrote long, bitter letters to his sons, who had been sent to boarding school in St. Petersburg, letters full of paranoia and demands for money and accusations of filial ingratitude. In 1839, 2 years after his wife's death, he was found dead on his estate, and the rumor never confirmed, never fully denied, was that his own serfs had murdered him, held him down and poured vodka down his throat until he choked or his heart gave out. Fyodor was 17. He was studying at the main engineering academy in St. Petersburg, training to be a military engineer, which was a practical career his father had insisted upon because it came with a salary and a rank. He was not good at it. He spent his time reading Pushkin, Gogol, Schiller, Balzac, the Gothic novelists, anything he could find, and drawing up plans for buildings he would never construct. When news of his father's death arrived, he had what friends later described as a seizure, the first of what would become a lifelong pattern of epileptic episodes that would shape not just his health, but his writing, his sense of time, his understanding of consciousness itself. There is no way to know if the epilepsy began with his father's death or simply became visible then, but Dostoevsky himself would always link the two, would always describe the aura before a seizure as a feeling of guilt and impending punishment, as though his own body were enacting some biblical logic of sin and retribution. St. Petersburg in the 1840s was a city of students and conspiracies and reading circles, a place where young men gathered in overheated apartments to argue about socialism and atheism and the future of Russia, where you could be exiled to Siberia for owning the wrong pamphlet. It was a new city barely a century old, built by Peter the Great on a swamp at the edge of the empire as a deliberate rejection of Moscow's Byzantine tradition, a window onto Europe, cold and rational and geometric. Dostoevsky loved it and hated it in equal measure. He loved the way the white nights in summer turned the sky into a kind of dream, the way the Nevsky Prospekt filled with people from every corner of the empire, the intellectual ferment, the sense that ideas mattered here in a way they didn't anywhere else in Russia. He hated the poverty, the way the beautiful facades hid courtyards filled with squalor, the way the city seemed designed to make you feel small and lost and inconsequential. He graduated from the academy in 1843 and worked as an engineer for exactly 1 year before resigning to become a writer. He had no money. His father's estate had been divided among the siblings and quickly sold off. He lived in a series of increasingly shabby apartments, borrowed money from everyone he knew, and wrote his first novel. Poor folk, in 1844 and 1845. It was an epistolary novel, a series of letters between a low-ranking civil servant named Makar Devushkin and a young woman named Varenka, both of them poor, both of them clinging to their dignity in a city that offered them none. The tone was sentimental, influenced by Gogol but without Gogol's cruelty, and when Dostoevsky finished it, he gave the manuscript to a friend, who gave it to Dmitry Grigorovich, who gave it to Nikolai Nekrasov, who was so moved he took it directly to Vissarion Belinsky, the most important literary critic in Russia. Belinsky read it overnight and declared Dostoevsky a genius. He sent word that the young writer should come see him immediately. Dostoevsky arrived at Belinsky's apartment in a state of disbelief. He was 23 years old. He had been a writer for less than 2 years. And here was Belinsky, the man whose essays everyone read, whose opinions could make or destroy a career, telling him that Poor Folk was a work of profound social conscience, that Dostoevsky understood the humiliated and insulted in a way no Russian writer had before, that he was the heir to Gogol, that he would change Russian literature. For a brief moment, Dostoevsky believed it. He was invited to salons. Other writers sought his company. He began to imagine himself as a major figure, and the recognition did something strange to him. It made him arrogant and insecure in equal measure, desperate to prove himself and convinced he had already proven everything. He wrote a second novel, The Double, in which a low-ranking civil servant named Goliadkin encounters his exact double, a doppelganger who is everything Goliadkin is not: confident, successful, charming, and who slowly takes over his life. It was a descent into madness told from the inside, claustrophobic and repetitive and deliberately unpleasant to read, and when it was published in 1846, it was met with confusion and disappointment. Belinsky, who had championed Poor Folk, found The Double tedious. Other critics were harsher. Dostoevsky's brief moment as the literary world's darling was over almost as soon as it had begun. He kept writing stories, sketches, a novella called Netochka Nezvanova that he never finished, but the work was uneven, and he knew it. He was trying to find his way, trying to understand what kind of writer he was, and the pressure of early fame followed by early failure made everything harder. He became defensive, prone to outbursts, difficult to be around. He fought with other writers. He developed a reputation for being touchy and vain. And in 1847, he began attending meetings of the Petrushevsky Circle, a group of young intellectuals who gathered on Friday evenings at the apartment of Mikhail Petrushevsky to discuss Fourier, socialism, the abolition of serfdom, censorship, and other ideas that the Tsarist government considered dangerous. It is hard to say exactly what Dostoevsky believed during those years. He was drawn to the utopian socialists, to the idea that society could be rationally reorganized to eliminate suffering, but he was also skeptical, prone to arguments, uncomfortable with dogma. He seems to have attended the meetings more out of intellectual curiosity and a desire for community than out of revolutionary fervor. But in 1849, in the wake of the revolutions that had swept across Europe the previous year, the Russian government decided to crack down on any hint of subversion. On April 22nd at 4 a.m, the police came to Dostoevsky's apartment and arrested him. He was taken to the Peter and Paul fortress and held in solitary confinement for 8 months while the authorities interrogated him and the other members of the circle. The cell was small, damp, and cold. There was no trial in any meaningful sense, just a military tribunal that had decided guilt in advance. On November 16, Dostoevsky and 20 others were taken to Semyonovsky Square, where a scaffold had been erected. They were told they had been sentenced to death by firing squad. They were dressed in white execution gowns. The first 3 men were tied to posts. The soldiers raised their rifles. And then, at the last possible moment, a messenger arrived on horseback with a reprieve from the Tsar. The death sentences were commuted. Dostoevsky would later write that those minutes on the scaffold waiting to die were the most vivid of his entire life, that he experienced time in a completely new way, that every second stretched into an eternity, that he looked at the golden dome of a nearby church and thought it was the last beautiful thing he would ever see. One of the men tied to the post went insane on the spot and never recovered. Dostoevsky was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, followed by an indefinite term of military service. They put him in chains, actual iron fetters around his ankles, and sent him east in a convoy of prisoners. The journey took weeks in the dead of winter. When he arrived at the prison in Omsk in western Siberia, it was 1850, and he was 28 years old, and everything he had been. The literary prodigy, the sensitive intellectual, the young man who read French novels and argued about Fourier was about to be taken apart. The prison was called the House of the Dead, and Dostoevsky would later write a book with that title, a fictionalized account of his years there that reads like a descent into a medieval underworld. The prisoners were murderers, thieves, deserters, political prisoners, men who had been brutalized by poverty and serfdom and violence and who now brutalized each other. They lived in barracks infested with lice, slept on bare wooden planks, worked in all weather doing hard manual labor, chopping wood, shoveling snow, hauling bricks, breaking rocks. The food was thin gruel and black bread. The guards were as cruel as the system allowed them to be. And the other prisoners hated Dostoevsky, not for anything he had done, but because he was educated, because he had been a gentleman, because he represented the class that had oppressed them their entire lives. He could not read. Books were forbidden except for a single copy of the New Testament, which he read over and over until he had memorized long passages. He could not write, or at least not openly, though he seems to have kept notes in secret, fragments that would later become the raw material for his fiction. He had epileptic seizures in the barracks, in front of the other prisoners, which made him even more of an outcast. Seizures were seen as a sign of demonic possession or moral weakness, something shameful. He was beaten more than once. He learned to keep his head down, to observe, to listen, to survive, and something happened to him there, something he would spend the rest of his life trying to articulate. He saw suffering up close, not the abstract suffering of the poor he had written about in Poor Folk, but immediate, physical, unrelenting suffering, and he saw that it did not ennoble people, that it often made them worse, crueler, more broken. But he also saw moments of grace, small acts of kindness or dignity that seemed to come from nowhere, and he began to develop a theory, or maybe a faith, that suffering could be a path to redemption if it was accepted, if it was borne with humility, if it led not to bitterness, but to a kind of spiritual transformation. He also became convinced that the socialists were wrong, that you could not engineer a better world through reason and systems, that human beings were too irrational, too contradictory, too fallen for any utopia to work. He came to believe that salvation was individual, spiritual, and probably impossible without Christian faith. This was the paradox at the center of everything he would write for the rest of his life. He believed in redemption, and he could not redeem himself. He believed suffering led to grace, and he resented every moment of his own suffering. He believed in Christian love, and he was often incapable of loving the people closest to him. He returned from Siberia in 1854, not as a broken man, but as a wired, haunted, furiously productive one, and the books he would write in the next 26 years would be attempts to work out the contradictions he had discovered in that prison, contradictions he found not in the world, but in himself. After his release, he was assigned to a military unit in Semipalatinsk, a remote garrison town on the edge of the Kazakh steppe, where he would spend the next 5 years as a soldier, still under surveillance, still not fully free. He was promoted to officer, which gave him a bit of status and a slightly better salary, and in 1857 he married a widow named Maria Dmitrievna Iseva, a woman he had fallen desperately in love with while she was still married to someone else. The marriage was a disaster almost from the beginning. She was ill with tuberculosis, prone to hysteria, and seems to have married him more for financial security than affection. He was obsessive, jealous, moody, and poor. They fought constantly. She took a lover. He spiraled into depression. But he also began writing again, stories, sketches, a short novel called The Village of Stepanchikovo that no one read. In 1859, he was finally allowed to return to St. Petersburg. He was 37 years old. He had been gone for 10 years, most of them spent in prison or exile, and the literary world had moved on without him. Turgenev was the major figure now. Tolstoy had just published Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth. Dostoevsky was yesterday's news, and worse, he was broke. He and his brother Mikhail started a literary journal called Vremya Time, which published a mix of fiction, criticism, and essays on Russian culture and politics, and for a few years it did well enough to keep them afloat. Dostoevsky serialized his prison memoir, Notes from the House of the Dead, in the journal, and it was recognized as a major work, a harrowing account of penal life, unlike anything else in Russian literature. But the journal's politics were complicated, trying to navigate between the Westernizers who wanted Russia to modernize along European lines and the Slavophiles who believed in Russia's unique spiritual destiny, and in 1863 the government shut it down for publishing an article that was judged too sympathetic to the Polish uprising. Dostoevsky was in financial ruin. Again, he had debts from the journal, debts from personal loans, and a new catastrophic problem. He had started gambling. In 1863, he traveled to Western Europe for the first time, ostensibly to improve his health, but really to chase a doomed love affair with a young woman named Apollinaria Suslova, who was beautiful and cold and much younger than him, and who seems to have enjoyed the power she had over him. They met in Paris, fought, broke up, got back together. She left him in Italy. He followed her to Baden-Baden, and while he was there he went to the casino and won a significant amount of money at roulette. The feeling it gave him, the rush, the sense of control, the belief that he could intuit the system, that he was on the verge of a massive win that would solve all his problems, was more powerful than any drug. He lost everything he had won, and then everything he had, and then borrowed more and lost that too. He would spend the next several years returning to the casinos over and over, always convinced that this time would be different, always losing, always writing desperate letters to friends and relatives begging for money, and the humiliation of it, the compulsiveness, the inability to stop even when he knew it was destroying him, would become one of the core experiences he mined for his fiction. The gambler who cannot stop, the man who knows he is ruining himself and does it anyway, the underground man who hoards his shame and parades it at the same time. In 1864, his life collapsed completely. His wife Maria died of tuberculosis in April. His brother Mikhail, his closest friend and collaborator, died of liver disease in July. He was suddenly responsible for both families, for his brother's widow and children and his own stepson, and he had no money and no prospects. He was 42 years old. He had written some good work notes from the House of the Dead, a handful of strong stories, but he had not yet written anything that would justify Belinsky's faith in him, anything that would place him alongside Turgenev or Tolstoy. And then, in the winter of 1864, holed up in a miserable apartment in St. Petersburg, drowning in debt and grief, he wrote Notes from Underground. It is a short book, barely a novella, and it is one of the most corrosive, uncomfortable, brilliant pieces of literature ever written. The narrator is a retired civil servant, a man of around 40 who lives alone in a squalid apartment and addresses the reader directly in a voice that is bitter, self-lacerating, contradictory, and utterly compulsive. He announces in the first line, "I am a sick man, I am a spiteful man, I am an unattractive man." He argues against the socialists, against utilitarianism, against the idea that human beings are rational creatures who act in their own self-interest. He insists that people will act against their own self-interest just to prove they are free, that they will choose suffering and chaos over happiness if happiness feels like submission to a system. He tells a long, humiliating story about a dinner party where he insults everyone and then follows a prostitute home and delivers a monologue about redemption and love, only to later treat her cruelly because her genuine response to him makes him feel exposed and ashamed. The underground man is not a hero. He is not even likable. But he is unbearably human, and the voice Dostoevsky gave him resentful, brilliant, self-aware, and self-deceiving in the same breath would become the template for almost everything he wrote afterward. The character who knows the right thing and does the opposite. The person who wants love and destroys it the moment it's offered. The intellectual who talks himself into moral paralysis. Notes from Underground was not widely read when it first appeared, but it would later be recognized as the opening move of existentialism, the first great expression of the modern self as a site of contradiction and bad faith. He needed money desperately, so he signed an exploitive contract with a publisher named Stolovsky, who agreed to pay him a lump sum in exchange for the rights to reissue his earlier work and one new novel, to be delivered by November 1, 1866, or else Stolovsky would own the rights to everything Dostoevsky wrote for the next 9 years. It was a trap, and Dostoevsky knew it, but he took the money because he had no choice. He spent the advance immediately, on debts and on another gambling trip to Wiesbaden, where he lost everything and had to pawn his coat and his watch to afford the train fare home. By the fall of 1866, the deadline was approaching, and he had not written a word of the novel he owed Stolovsky. He was also in the middle of serializing Crime and Punishment in a literary journal, writing it month by month, always just ahead of the deadline, and the pressure was crushing him. Friends suggested he hire a stenographer to help speed up the process. He did, and on October 4th a young woman named Anna Grigorievna Snitkina arrived at his apartment to take dictation. She was 20 years old, shy, competent, and a little in awe of him. He was 44, disheveled, intense, and famous in a troubled, controversial way. He dictated to her every day for 26 days straight, and in that time they produced a short novel called The Gambler, which is exactly what it sounds like, a feverish, semi-autobiographical account of a man who cannot stop gambling, who loses everything, who is addicted not just to roulette, but to the feeling of being on the edge of disaster. They finished it on October 30th, one day before the deadline, and delivered it to Stolovsky, who looked for a loophole and couldn't find one. And then Dostoevsky, who had spent most of his adult life making catastrophic decisions, made the single best decision of his life. He asked Anna to marry him. She said yes. They were married in February 1867, and whatever else can be said about their marriage, and there is a lot to say, much of it complicated, it saved him. She managed his money, kept creditors at bay, negotiated with publishers, organized his manuscripts, and most importantly, believed in him unconditionally. She was not a doormat. She had opinions and a temper and could stand up to him when he was being impossible. But she also took on the practical burdens of his life in a way that freed him to write, which he did, enormously. Starting in 1866 with Crime and Punishment and continuing for the next 15 years, Dostoevsky wrote a series of novels that are among the greatest achievements in world literature, books that are dense and difficult and awkward and also alive in a way very few novels are. Books that feel less like carefully constructed narratives and more like raw arguments with God. Crime and Punishment is the story of Raskolnikov, a poor student in St. Petersburg who convinces himself that he is an extraordinary man, a Napoleon, and that therefore he has the right to commit murder if it serves a higher purpose. He kills an old pawnbroker and her sister with an axe, and then the novel becomes an extended psychological unraveling, as he discovers that he is not, in fact, beyond guilt, that his conscience will not leave him alone, that he cannot think or reason his way out of what he has done. The detective, Porfiry Petrovitch, pursues him not with evidence but with conversation, engaging him in long philosophical debates, waiting for him to confess simply because the weight of his guilt becomes unbearable. And there is Sonia, a young woman forced into prostitution to support her family, who reads the Bible to Raskolnikov and represents the possibility of redemption through suffering and faith. The novel was serialized in a journal called The Russian Messenger over the course of 1866, and it was immediately recognized as a major work, disturbing and brilliant and unlike anything Tolstoy or Turgenev were writing. Where Tolstoy wrote about families and history in the countryside, Dostoevsky wrote about crime and madness and the city. Where Turgenev was elegant and ironic, Dostoevsky was fevered and relentless. Crime and Punishment was not about whether Raskolnikov would be caught. It was about whether he could live with himself, and whether suffering could lead him back to his own humanity. In 1867, right after their marriage, Dostoevsky and Anna left Russia to escape his creditors. They spent the next 4 years abroad, mostly in Germany and Switzerland, living in cheap rooms, moving from city to city, always short of money because Dostoevsky kept gambling. He would promise Anna he wouldn't, and then he would go to Baden-Baden or Wiesbaden or Sachsen-Lilsbanes and lose everything, and she would sit in their room waiting, knowing what was happening, and when he returned she would be furious and he would be abject, and then they would run out of money, and he would write desperate letters to friends begging for loans, and then he would write another chapter of whatever novel he was working on to earn an advance from his publisher, and then the cycle would begin again. Their first child, a daughter named Sonia, was born in Geneva in 1868. She died 3 months later of pneumonia. Dostoevsky was destroyed by it, racked with guilt, convinced it was punishment for his sins. Anna was devastated, but also the one who had to keep functioning, who had to arrange the burial, who had to manage the grief of both of them. And through all of this, Dostoevsky was writing The Idiot, which he had promised to the Russian messenger, and which he was making up as he went, with almost no plan, under constant financial pressure. The Idiot is about a man named Prince Myshkin, who is good. Not complicated, not morally ambiguous, just good, kind, honest, compassionate, Christ-like. Dostoevsky wanted to see what would happen if you put a genuinely good person into the corrupt, cynical world of St. Petersburg society. What happens is that everyone misunderstands him, manipulates him, or falls apart around him. He is engaged to one woman, Aglaya, who is proud and intelligent and wants him to be more assertive, more worldly. He is also drawn to another woman, Nastasia Filipovna, who has been abused and discarded by men, and who swings wildly between self-destruction and a desperate need to be saved. Myshkin tries to save her. He fails. By the end of the novel, Nastasia is murdered by Rogozhin, a man who loved her obsessively, and Myshkin, who witnesses the aftermath, loses his mind completely and is sent back to the Swiss sanatorium where the novel began. It is a haunting, uneven, occasionally maddening book, and it asks a question that Dostoevsky would return to again and again. Is goodness even possible in this world? And if it is, does it matter? Myshkin's goodness does not save anyone. It may even make things worse, and yet the novel refuses to be cynical about him. There is something sacred in his failure, something Dostoevsky wanted the reader to feel, even if he could not quite articulate it. He finished The Idiot in 1869, and he and Anna moved to Dresden, where they lived for several years. They had more children, a daughter, Lubov, born in 1869, and a son, Fyodor, born in 1871. Dostoevsky gambled less, not because he had conquered the compulsion, but because Anna started managing the money more strictly, giving him only small amounts at a time. He was in his late 40s now, his health deteriorating, his epilepsy worse, but his creative powers were at their height. He began working on his next novel, Demons, which was inspired by a real political murder, that had shocked Russia. A young radical named Ivanov had been killed by members of his own revolutionary cell, led by a man named Sergei Nechayev, because he had questioned the group's tactics. Demons, also translated as The Possessed or The Devils, is Dostoevsky's most directly political novel, a savage critique of the nihilist radicals who believed that Russian society needed to be torn down completely before it could be rebuilt. The character of Fyodor Stepanovich Verkovensky is based on Nechayev, a manipulative, amoral revolutionary who cares nothing for ideas and everything for power and chaos. The character of Stavrogin, around whom the whole novel revolves, is something else, a man of great charisma and intelligence who has lost the ability to feel anything, who has committed terrible acts out of a kind of spiritual emptiness, and who cannot find his way back to belief or meaning. The novel is sprawling, chaotic, darkly comic, and furious. It is also deeply unfair in the way it caricatures the radicals, reducing complex political movements to the actions of madmen and charlatans, but it is also prophetic. Dostoevsky saw, before almost anyone else, that ideological certainty combined with moral relativism could lead to catastrophic violence, that people who believed they were building a better world could justify any atrocity, that the revolutionary who claimed to love humanity in the abstract often had nothing but contempt for actual human beings. Demons was published serially between 1871 and 1872, and it was controversial. The radicals hated it. The conservatives loved it a little too much. Dostoevsky's politics were shifting rightward, toward a reactionary Russian nationalism that was hard to separate from his Christian mysticism. He believed in the spiritual uniqueness of the Russian people, in their capacity for suffering and redemption, and he was increasingly suspicious of Western rationalism, Western materialism, Western ideas in general. This was the era of the Slavophile movement, and Dostoevsky became one of its most passionate, if idiosyncratic, voices. But his politics were always secondary to his psychology. What he was interested in always was not what people believed, but why they believed it, what needs or wounds or terrors were driving them. Stavrogin is not interesting because he is a nihilist. He is interesting because he is a man who has tried everything: belief, unbelief, transgression, asceticism, and found that none of it touches the emptiness inside him. He is the underground man taken to a metaphysical extreme. In 1871, Dostoevsky and Anna finally returned to Russia. They settled in St. Petersburg, and for the first time in years, Dostoevsky had something approaching stability. He was a well-known writer, not rich, but not destitute. He had a family. He stopped gambling finally in 1871 after one last disastrous trip to Wiesbaden, and he never gambled again. He became the editor of a conservative journal called The Citizen, which gave him a platform for his political essays, though he found the work exhausting and quit after a year. He started a new project, a kind of personal journal called A Writer's Diary, in which he published essays, sketches, and stories on Russian life, politics, and culture. It was wildly popular and gave him a direct relationship with readers in a way serialized novels did not. But he was also working on his next novel, the one that would become The Brothers Karamazov, and it was taking shape slowly, across years, as a vast summation of everything he had been thinking about for decades. He wanted to write about faith and doubt, about fathers and sons, about the problem of evil, about whether it is possible to love your neighbor, about whether God exists and, if he does, whether he can be forgiven for the suffering he allows. He wanted to write a murder mystery that was also a theological argument. He wanted to create characters who contained within themselves all the contradictions of belief and unbelief, who could articulate the strongest possible case against God and the strongest possible case for him, and leave the reader to decide. He began serializing the Brothers Karamazov in 1879, and it would run for 2 years, until 1880. The novel is enormous, over 800 pages in most editions, and it tells the story of the Karamazov family. Fyodor Pavlovich, the father, a buffoon and a sensualist who has neglected and humiliated his sons. Dmitri, the eldest, passionate and impulsive and drowning in debt. Ivan, the intellectual, an atheist who has constructed an elegant argument against God. Alyosha, the youngest, a novice monk who is gentle and faithful and still learning how to live in the world. And Smerdyakov, the illegitimate son, a servant who may not be epaulette and ever said. The novel begins with a family meeting at the local monastery, mediated by the elders of Sima, a monk who represents for Dostoevsky the ideal of Christian love, humble, wise, free of judgment. It is supposed to resolve the conflict between Fyodor and Dmitri, who are both in love with the same woman, a woman named Grushenka, who is beautiful and damaged and more complicated than either of them understands. The meeting resolves nothing. The conflicts deepen. And then, halfway through the novel, Fyodor Pavlovitch is murdered in his own house, and Dmitri is arrested for the crime. And the rest of the novel is an investigation by the police, by the reader, by the brothers themselves, into who killed him and why, but also into the deeper question of who is responsible, morally, spiritually, for the murder. Because the truth is that almost everyone wanted Fyodor dead. Dmitri had threatened to kill him. Ivan had said that if God does not exist, everything is permitted, and Smerdyakov, who worshipped Ivan, seems to have taken that as permission. Alyosha, the good son, loved his father but could not save him, and Fyodor himself, vain and cruel and ridiculous, may have authored his own death through the way he lived. The novel is structured around long conversations, some of which go on for dozens of pages, and these conversations are not asides or digressions, they are the novel. The chapter, called Rebellion, in which Ivan lays out his case against God, is one of the most powerful pieces of atheist writing ever produced. Ivan does not deny that God might exist. He denies that a world with so much suffering, especially the suffering of children who have done nothing to deserve it, can be the creation of a loving God. He tells Alyosha stories of children being tortured, abused, torn apart by dogs, and he says that no future harmony, no heavenly redemption, can justify that suffering. If the price of paradise is the tears of a single tortured child, Ivan says, he respectfully returns his ticket. It is a devastating argument, and Dostoevsky does not refute it. He has Alyosha weep and kiss his brother, but he does not give him a counter-argument, not in words. The response, if there is one, comes in the next chapter, The Grand Inquisitor, which is a story Ivan tells Alyosha, a parable set in Seville during the Inquisition. Christ has returned to earth, and he is recognized by the people, and he performs miracles, and the Grand Inquisitor has him arrested. That night the Inquisitor visits Christ in his cell and delivers a monologue in which he explains that the Church has corrected Christ's work, that Christ offered people freedom, which is a burden they cannot bear, and that the Church has instead given them miracle, mystery, and authority, which allow them to be happy in their submission. The Inquisitor says that he and the Church love humanity more than Christ does, because they understand human weakness, and at the end, Christ says nothing. He simply kisses the Inquisitor on his old, bloodless lips, and the Inquisitor lets him go. It is one of the most debated passages in all of literature. Is the Grand Inquisitor the villain? Or is he tragic? Or is he right? Is Christ's silence a weakness or the ultimate response? Is the kiss forgiveness or judgment, or something beyond both? Dostoevsky does not tell you. He gives you Ivan's voice, brilliant and bitter, and full of love for humanity, and he gives you the silence of Christ, and he asks you to hold both. The novel continues for hundreds more pages. There is a trial, in which Dmitri is convicted of a murder he did not commit, largely because he cannot articulate his innocence in a way the court will accept. There is Smerdykov's confession to Ivan, and then Smerdyakov's suicide. There is Ivan's breakdown, his hallucination of the devil, who appears as a shabby gentleman and taunts him with the logic of his own atheism. There is Alyosha's work in the world, trying to teach children about love and forgiveness, trying to live out the lessons of Zosima, even though Zosima is dead, and even though the world does not seem to reward goodness. And there is Dmitri, in prison, having a vision of a suffering child, a wee one, and deciding that even though he did not kill his father, he will accept his punishment, because he is guilty of having wanted to, because suffering might redeem him, because he needs to believe that redemption is possible. The novel ends not with answers, but with a kind of fragile hope. Alyosha speaks at the funeral of a boy named Ilyusha, a boy the other children had tormented, and who has died of illness, and he tells them to remember this moment, to hold on to the love they feel for each other, to believe that they will all meet again in the resurrection. It is sentimental, and it is sincere, and it is the closest as Dostoevsky ever came to affirming faith without irony or complication. But even here the affirmation is surrounded by death and doubt, and the knowledge that the world is brutal, and that goodness is fragile. The Brothers Karamazov was published in book form in 1880, and it was immediately recognized as a masterpiece. Readers and critics saw it as the culmination of Dostoevsky's career, the novel in which all his obsessions, guilt, redemption, faith, the limits of reason, the psychology of the criminal, the problem of evil came together in a single, sprawling, polyphonic work. It was also exhausting. Dostoevsky had been writing at a furious pace for years, under constant financial pressure, always just ahead of the deadline, and his health was failing. He had chronic emphysema. His epilepsy was worse, and his doctors had told him to slow down, but he could not. He planned a sequel to Karamazov, in which Alyosha would leave the monastery and go out into the world, would perhaps become a revolutionary, would be tested in ways the first novel had only hinted at. He made notes. He talked about it with Anna. But he never wrote it. On January 26, 1881, he had an argument with his sister about a family property dispute. He became agitated, and something ruptured in his lungs. He began coughing up blood. Anna sent for the doctors, but they could do nothing. He spent the next 2 days in bed, lucid but weak, saying goodbye to his children, asking Anna to read to him from the New Testament, the same book he had carried through Siberia. He died on January 28 at 8:38 in the evening. He was 59 years old. His funeral was a massive public event. Thousands of people lined the streets of St. Petersburg. Students, workers, writers, people who had never met him, but who felt they knew him through his books. He was buried in the Tikhvin cemetery at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery, and the speeches at his grave praised him as a great Russian patriot, a Christian moralist, a voice of the people. Turgenev, his old rival, was too ill to attend, but sent a letter acknowledging Dostoevsky's genius, even though they had never liked each other. Tolstoy, who had once dismissed Dostoevsky's work as hysterical, would later say that The Brothers Karamazov was the greatest novel ever written. But the myth that built up around Dostoevsky in the years after his death was strange and contested. In Russia, he became a symbol of the national soul, the writer who had articulated the spiritual depth and suffering of the Russian people, and this was claimed by both the religious right and later by the Soviets, who tried to downplay his Christianity and emphasize his critique of inequality and his sympathy for the oppressed. In the West, he was read as a proto-existentialist, a psychologist of alienation and bad faith, the writer who had mapped the underground territory of the modern self. Nietzsche, who rarely praised anyone, said that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. Freud analyzed the Brothers Karamazov as a case study in patricide and guilt. Kafka read him obsessively. Camus wrote that the question of suicide, which opens the myth of Sisyphus, is the question Dostoevsky asked over and over in different forms. And all of this is true, or at least partially true, but it also misses something, which is that Dostoevsky was not primarily a philosopher or a psychologist or a political thinker. He was a novelist, and what he cared about was dramatizing ideas, putting them in the mouths of characters and letting them argue and suffer and contradict themselves. He did not write to prove a point. He wrote to explore what happened when people believed certain things, when they tried to live out certain ideas, when they were pulled between faith and doubt, love and cruelty, the desire for redemption and the inability to forgive themselves. The central tension in his work, the thing that makes it so uncomfortable and so alive, is that the man who wrote the most profound Christian fiction of the 19th century was not a saint. He was a gambler who destroyed his own life repeatedly. He was cruel to his first wife. He was a difficult, demanding husband to his second wife, even though she saved him. He was a reactionary nationalist who said things about Poles and Jews that are ugly and inexcusable. He believed in suffering as a path to grace, but he also resented his own suffering and inflicted suffering on others. He wanted to be Alyosha, but he was much more like Ivan, or Raskolnikov, or the underground man, brilliant, tormented, unable to stop thinking, unable to live comfortably in his own skin. And this is not a contradiction, he resolved. It is the engine of his work. He knew that belief was hard, that faith was not a steady state, but a struggle, that people were capable of great love and great cruelty, often in the same breath. He knew that the person who wants to be good is often the person most aware of their own badness, and that this awareness can be paralyzing, or it can be the beginning of something like redemption, though redemption might just mean learning to live with yourself. His influence on literature is almost impossible to measure because it is everywhere. You can trace a line from Dostoevsky to the existentialists, to Kafka's sense of guilt and absurdity, to Camus' Rebel, to Sartre's Bad Faith. You can see him in the psychological realism of modern fiction, in the way contemporary novels take consciousness seriously, in the way we accept that characters can be contradictory and unreliable, and still be the centers of their own stories. You can see him in crime novels, in the way the detective story became a vehicle for philosophy in the hands of writers like Borges or Umberto Eco. You can see him in film, in Bresson's Spiritual Severity, in Tarkovsky's Meditations on Faith and Doubt, in the moral ambiguity of prestige television. But you can also just read him, and that is a different experience, because reading Dostoevsky is not like reading most other writers. It is not elegant. It is not streamlined. The sentences are often awkward, the plots melodramatic, the coincidences absurd. Characters give speeches that go on for pages. The narrator intrudes constantly, commenting, editorializing, asking questions. It is excessive, overwrought, exhausting. And it is also more alive than almost anything else in literature, because Dostoevsky was not interested in polish or control. He was interested in getting as close as possible to the chaos of being human, to the way people think and feel and contradict themselves, to the way suffering and grace and cruelty and love all exist in the same moment, and he was willing to sacrifice everything, elegance, restraint, subtlety, to get that onto the page. There is a moment near the end of Crime and Punishment when Raskolnikov, who has confessed his crime and been sent to Siberia, is in prison, and he has a dream. He dreams that a plague has spread across the world, a plague that makes people absolutely certain they are right, that their ideas are the only true ideas, and because everyone is certain and no one can compromise, civilization collapses into violence and chaos. It is a vision of ideological certainty as a kind of madness, and when Raskolnikov wakes up, he is not cured, not redeemed, but he looks out the window and sees Sonia, who has followed him to Siberia, and something in him begins to soften. It is not a happy ending, and it is not a neat ending, but it is an ending that insists on the possibility of change, on the possibility that suffering, if it is borne with humility, might lead somewhere other than bitterness. And that insistence, fragile, uncertain, always in tension with doubt, is what runs through all of Dostoevsky's work. He believed in redemption, and he knew how hard it was, and he never stopped asking whether it was possible, and he never stopped writing as though the answer mattered. In the years after his death, Anna dedicated herself to preserving his legacy. She published his letters, his notebooks, her own memoir of their life together. She was fiercely protective of his reputation and also remarkably honest about his flaws. She lived until 1918, surviving the Russian Revolution and dying just as the old world Dostoevsky had written about was disappearing completely. Their children had mixed fates. Lyubov became a writer and memoirist, though her life was difficult, and she ended up in exile. Fyodor, the son, had mental health struggles and died relatively young. The family line continued, but the descendants scattered, and the direct connection to Dostoevsky became a matter of archives and letters rather than living memory. The Soviet Union had a complicated relationship with Dostoevsky. He was too Christian, too critical of radicals, too nationalistic in the wrong way. But he was also too major to ignore, and so he was published, taught, and carefully contextualized, his religion downplayed, his critique of suffering and oppression emphasized. Dissidents read him differently, saw in his work a defense of the individual conscience against systems and ideologies, a refusal to let human beings be reduced to social or economic categories. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Dostoevsky was reclaimed by the Orthodox Church, held up as a symbol of Russian spiritual identity, and this too was a simplification, a use of his work to serve an agenda he might not have fully endorsed. In the West, he has been endlessly adapted, translated, analyzed. There are films of Crime and Punishment, of The Idiot, of the Brothers Karamazov, some of them brilliant, some of them missing the point entirely. There are academic industries devoted to his psychology, his theology, his politics. There are readers who come to him looking for answers to the big questions. Does God exist? How should we live? What is the meaning of suffering? And there are readers who come to him for the characters, for Raskolnikov's fever dreams, for Mishkin's heartbreak, for Ivan's brilliance and Alyosha's goodness, and Dmitri's wild, desperate energy. And the strange thing is that Dostoevsky works on both levels. You can read him as philosophy, as a sustained engagement with the deepest questions of existence, and you can also read him as melodrama, as a page-turning mystery full of passionate speeches and unlikely coincidences and people fainting at crucial moments. He is both, and he does not see a contradiction between them, because for him the big questions were never abstract. They were always embodied in specific people in specific situations, people who were trying to live and failing and trying again. There is a tendency, especially in the 21st century, to read Dostoevsky as a prophet, to see in his work a prediction of the ideological disasters of the 20th century, of totalitarianism, of the ways that utopian visions can justify any atrocity. And there is truth in that reading. He did see something that his contemporaries missed, did understand that ideas about human nature have consequences, that if you believe people are perfectible through reason or revolution, you might end up treating actual people as obstacles to be removed. But he was not writing allegories. He was writing novels, and the characters in his novels are not symbols, they are people, and they are particular, and their particularity matters. Raskolnikov is not just an emblem of nihilism. He is a specific young man, poor and proud and desperately lonely, who reads too much and thinks too much and convinces himself of something that falls apart the moment he acts on it. Ivan Karamazov is not just an atheist. He is a person who loves his brother, who is torn apart by his own intelligence, who wants to believe and cannot, and hates himself for it. Mishkin is not just Christ. He is a man who has been sick, who was awkward, insincere, and often misunderstood, whose goodness does not protect him from the world's cruelty. What Dostoevsky gives you, more than answers, is the experience of being inside someone else's struggle. You feel Raskolnikov's paranoia. You feel Mishkin's helplessness. You feel Ivan's rage and Alyosha's hope and Dmitri's chaos, and you feel the weight of the questions they are asking, not as abstract propositions, but as lived dilemmas. What do you do if you no longer believe in God, but you still feel guilt? What do you do if you have hurt someone and cannot undo it? What do you do if you want to be good, but you do not know how? What do you do if you love someone and your love destroys them? These are not questions with clean answers, and Dostoevsky does not pretend they are. But he takes them seriously. He refuses to dismiss them as neurotic or outdated. He insists that they matter, that how you answer them shapes not just your ideas, but your life, your relationships, your soul, if you believe in such a thing. And this is why his work endures, why people still read him even though the sentences are sometimes clunky and the plots sometimes absurd and the politics sometimes repellent. Because he wrote about the things that do not go away, the things every generation has to confront again: guilt, suffering, the desire for meaning, the fear that there is no meaning, the hope that love might be enough, even when it clearly is not, the suspicion that suffering might be redemptive, even though it mostly just hurts, the possibility that grace might exist, even though you cannot earn it and you do not deserve it and you are not even sure what it would look like if it arrived. In the Brothers Karamazov, there is a moment when Father Zosima, the elder who represents for Dostoevsky the possibility of Christian love, tells Alyosha, "Love a man, even in his sin, for that is the semblance of divine love and is the highest love on earth." It is a beautiful sentence, and it is also almost impossible to practice. Dostoevsky knew that. He spent his whole life failing to practice it, but he kept believing in it, or trying to believe in it, or writing characters who believed in it even when he could not. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the value of Dostoevsky's work is not that it gives you faith, or answers, or a program for how to live. Maybe the value is that it shows you what it looks like to wrestle with these things, to take them seriously, to refuse to let them go even when they become unbearable. Maybe the value is that it tells you over and over in 1,000 different ways that you are not alone in your doubt, or your guilt, or your longing, or your failure to be the person you want to be. That other people have felt this way. That the struggle itself is part of being human, and that there is something sacred in that struggle, even if you never win, even if you die without answers, even if all you have at the end is the hope that the wee one in your dream might somehow matter, that the kiss you give or receive might mean something, that love, however broken, might still be real. Dostoevsky died believing in God, or trying to believe in God, or wanting to believe in God badly enough that the distinction no longer mattered. He died believing in the Russian people, in their capacity for suffering and redemption, and history would complicate that belief in ways he could not have imagined. He died believing that literature mattered, that stories could change people, that the novel was a form capable of holding the deepest questions and the messiest contradictions, and in that belief, at least, he was absolutely right. His grave in St. Petersburg is still visited by readers from all over the world. They leave flowers, notes, small tokens. Some of them are religious pilgrims, drawn to the Christian dimension of his work. Some of them are students, reading him for class. Some of them are just people who felt something when they read one of his novels, who recognized themselves in one of his characters, who found in his work a reflection of their own inner chaos and a suggestion, fragile, uncertain, but present, that this chaos might lead somewhere, that it might mean something, that it might, if you could bear it long enough, turn into something like grace. The books remain. The sentences awkward and urgent, the characters unforgettable, the questions unanswered, the tension unresolved, the man who believed in redemption and could not redeem himself, the novelist who wrote about suffering as a path to God, and spent his life running from his own suffering into gambling halls and doomed love affairs and fevers of writing that barely kept the creditors at bay, the believer who gave the atheist the best lines, the Christian who tortured his characters and loved them for their capacity to endure the torture, the prophet who was also a gambler, the psychologist who was also a mystic, the man who wrote about crime and punishment and grace, and did not know, any more than his characters did, what the balance between them might be, or whether such a balance was even possible, but who kept writing as though the question mattered, as though the act of asking it might be a kind of answer, or at least a kind of prayer.